He humiliated her on their wedding night. But when he saw her happy with another man, jealousy drove him completely insane. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to see how far this jealousy will go. The scent of white roses permeated every corner of the luxurious Manhattan penthouse, mixing with the faint smoke of scented candles that cast dancing shadows on the silk-covered walls in ivory. Grace Mitchell stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Central Park, watching the city lights twinkle like fallen stars on the wet pavement below. Her wedding dress, a creation of Valencian lace that had belonged to her grandmother, whispered against the marble floor with each breath. She was 32 years old, with raven-black hair that fell in soft waves to the middle of her back, and amber eyes that always seemed to hold ancient secrets. Her hands, slender and elegant, trembled slightly as she held the crystal glass a waiter had handed her moments before. The California champagne bubbled with promises of happiness that she, in her naivety, still believed possible. Alexander Sterling approached from behind, and Grace felt the warmth of his presence before hearing his footsteps on the Persian carpet. He was an imposing man, 45 years old, with salt and pepper hair slicked back and a square jaw that suggested unwavering determination. His grey eyes, cold as steel, settled on her with an expression Grace couldn't interpret at that moment. "My wife," he pronounced, savoring each syllable as if tasting aged wine. How good that sounds. She turned, smiling with the hope of a woman who had just given her life to a man she had barely known for 6 months. The courtship had been whirlwind. Exotic flowers arriving each morning at her modest apartment in Charleston, dinners at restaurants where a single dish cost more than her monthly salary, lightning trips to Paris and Vienna where Alexander had showered her with jewels and promises. "Alexander," she whispered, extending her hand to caress his cheek, "I still can't believe this is real." He captured her wrist with a quick movement, not violent but not tender either. His fingers closed like velvet shackles, while a smile that didn't reach his eyes formed on his perfectly shaved face. "There's something you need to know, Grace." The tone of his voice had changed. It was no longer the seductive whisper of previous months, but something harsher, more authentic. Grace felt a chill run down her spine, but forced herself to maintain composure. "What's wrong?" Alexander released her and walked toward the table where the bottle of champagne rested. He poured himself another glass with meticulous movements, as if each gesture were choreographed to maximize the impact of what he was about to say. "This marriage," he began, without looking at her, "is a business arrangement. Nothing more, nothing less." The words fell on Grace like stones thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that expanded in concentric circles of confusion and pain. She blinked several times, convinced she had heard wrong. "I don't understand. It's quite simple, dear." Alexander finally turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw for the first time the calculating coldness that had always been there, hidden under layers of artificial charm. "Your father needed money to save his company. I needed a wife from a good Southern family to clean up my image with certain conservative investors. We both got what we wanted." Grace felt the floor open beneath her feet, the roses decorating the room. Previously symbols of romance now seemed like funeral flowers adorning her own emotional tomb. The perfume she had chosen so carefully for that night, a fragrance of jasmine and bergamot that had cost her 3-month savings, now made her nauseous. "My father," her voice broke. "My father would never do something like that. Your father would do anything to save the family legacy." Alexander took a long sip from his glass. "Men always do anything to protect what we consider ours. You were simply the most convenient bargaining chip." A tear escaped from Grace's left eye, sliding down her cheek like a solitary river seeking the sea. She didn't bother to wipe it away. There was something liberating in allowing her pain to be visible, even before the same man who caused it. "And what do you expect from me now, Sun?" she asked, and her voice, though trembling, contained a dignity she didn't even know she possessed. Alexander seemed surprised by the question. Perhaps he expected screams, pleas, a dramatic collapse that would allow him to feel even more powerful. Instead, he found a woman who, even in her most vulnerable moment, refused to completely crumble. "I expect you to fulfill your role. You'll attend social events by my side, smile for photographs, keep up appearances. In return, you'll have access to everything money can buy. You'll live in this penthouse, have unlimited credit cards, travel wherever you wish. Many women would kill to be in your position." Grace looked around, seeing for the first time the gilded cage she had voluntarily entered. The paintings by renowned artists adorning the walls, the antique furniture imported from all over Europe, the silk curtains that cost more than a mid-range car. Everything that hours before had seemed magical now revealed itself as what it really was: the price of her freedom. "And love?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Alexander laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in an empty cathedral. "Love is a luxury that businessmen can't afford, dear. But don't worry. In time, you'll learn to appreciate the advantages of our situation." He approached her and deposited a cold kiss on her forehead, like a father saying goodbye to a daughter before a long journey. Then, without further words, he walked toward the master bedroom door. "Tonight I'll sleep in the guest suite. Tomorrow we have breakfast with the Anderson Smiths. Make sure you look presentable." The door closed with a soft click, and Grace was left alone among the white roses that were already beginning to wither. She sank onto the burgundy velvet sofa, and for the first time in years, allowed her tears to flow without restriction. But even in that moment of absolute devastation, something began to germinate in the deepest part of her being. A tiny seed of determination that, with time, would bloom into something she couldn't even imagine. Outside, New York continued to shine, indifferent to the drama unfolding in that Upper East Side penthouse. And Grace, wiping away tears with the back of her hand, made a silent promise to the woman she saw reflected in the window. "This won't be the end," she thought. "This will be the beginning." The first days passed in a fog of unreality. Grace moved through the penthouse like an elegant ghost, mechanically fulfilling the obligations her new role demanded. She smiled in photographs, exchanged banalities with wives of businessmen who looked at her with a mixture of envy and pity, and each night returned to an empty bed where Egyptian cotton sheets felt like shrouds. Alexander maintained a courteous distance, appearing only when social circumstances required it. In public, he played the role of devoted husband with a skill that bordered on disturbing. He took her hand, whispered affectionate words in her ear, looked at her with adoration so convincing that Grace sometimes wondered if she hadn't dreamed that conversation on her wedding night. But then the nights came, and the mask fell. One morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, Grace found on the breakfast table a folder of documents that Alexander had apparently left carelessly. Her instinct screamed at her not to touch them, to preserve the ignorance that at least allowed her to function. But her hands, those hands that had always sought truth hidden under layers of varnish and paint, couldn't resist. The contracts were there, in black and white, dated 6 months before her first meeting with Alexander. Agreements between Sterling Enterprises and Mitchell Construction, where her father, Richard Mitchell, accepted a loan of $3 million in exchange for her. There was no other way to interpret it. The contract specified that the marriage must take place within a maximum period of 8 months, that Grace must remain married for at least 5 years for the debt to be settled, and that any attempt at divorce before that period would result in the immediate execution of the loan plus interest that would lead the Mitchell family to total ruin. Grace's hands trembled when she dropped the papers on the table. The coffee she had been drinking had gone cold, but she didn't notice. All she could feel was the icy void expanding in her chest, consuming every vestige of trust she had once placed in her father. Richard Mitchell, the man who had taught her to walk, who had told her stories of brave princesses before bed, who had cried with pride at her college graduation. That same man had sold her as if she were property, another asset in a business negotiation. The phone's ringtone pulled her from her trance. It was her mother, Eleanor, with her singing voice that always smelled of lavender and patience. "Gracie, my love, how are you? Your father and I are so happy you found such a wonderful man. Alexander is quite the gentleman, isn't he?" Grace closed her eyes. Would her mother know? Had she been complicit in the deception, or was she as much a victim as Grace of the decisions of a man who believed he had the right to control the destinies of those around him. "Mom," her voice sounded strange, distant, "can I ask you a question?" "Of course, my dear. What's wrong?" "Did you know Alexander before I met him?" The silence on the other end of the line was the only answer she needed, a silence that stretched for 3, 5, 8 seconds, until Eleanor cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Well, your father had met him at some business events. You know how those things are." "I understand," Grace said, and hung up without saying goodbye. She stared at the phone for long minutes, feeling each pillar of her life crumbling one after another. The family she thought she knew, the love she thought would bloom, the life she had imagined building. Everything was a lie. Everything had always been a lie. That afternoon, while the New York sun set, painting the sky with oranges and purples that seemed to mock her pain, Grace did something she hadn't done in years. She went down to the building's basement, where Alexander kept a collection of antiques he rarely visited, and allowed herself to get lost among forgotten objects. It was there she found it, a small rolled canvas, covered in dust and neglect, tucked in a corner next to broken furniture and unlabeled boxes. With expert hands, she carefully unrolled it, revealing a painting that made her heart stop. It was a portrait of a woman, probably from the 18th century, with technique suggesting a minor artist from the American colonial school. The painting was deteriorated, with deep cracks and areas where yellowed varnish hid colors that must have been vibrant. But the eyes of the portrayed woman, even under layers of dirt and time, seemed to look directly at Grace with an intensity that transcended centuries. Without thinking, her fingers began to trace the contours of the damage, mentally evaluating what techniques would be necessary to restore life to that forgotten work. It was an instinct she had cultivated in secret for years, since at 16 she had discovered her passion for art restoration at a summer workshop in Charleston. Alexander knew nothing about this. No one knew, except her grandmother Hope, who had died taking that secret to her grave. Grace had kept her talent deliberately hidden, perhaps intuiting that someday she would need something that was only hers, something no one could take away. That night, while Alexander attended a business dinner to which he hadn't invited her, Grace returned to the basement with improvised materials. She worked until her eyes burned and her fingers ached, delicately cleaning a small section of the canvas, revealing beneath it an ultramarine blue so pure it seemed torn from the Mediterranean sky. For the first time since her wedding night, Grace smiled genuinely. She had found something Alexander couldn't buy, sell, or control. She had found her refuge. The following months established a pattern that Grace learned to navigate with the precision of a sailor in treacherous waters. During the day, she played her role as decorative wife with a perfection that even Alexander had to admit was admirable. She attended charity galas where her dress was photographed for society magazines, organized dinners for investors where her smile never wavered, and accepted empty compliments with grace that hid the void she felt inside. But the nights belonged to her. When the penthouse fell silent and Alexander retired to his wing of the floor, Grace descended to the basement converted into sanctuary. She had set up a corner with proper lighting, obtained through creative excuses about interior decoration. She had acquired restoration materials by feigning interest in a new craft hobby that Alexander considered adorably trivial. The painting she had found turned out to be more significant than she initially thought. After weeks of careful research in libraries and online archives, Grace discovered it was probably the work of a forgotten American artist named Francis Beaumont, a minor contemporary of Gilbert Stuart, who had disappeared from historical records at the end of the 18th century. Each night, while the city slept, Grace dedicated hours to restoring that work. It was meticulous work requiring infinite patience, cleaning layer by layer the oxidized varnish, consolidating areas where paint was flaking, chromatically reintegrating the losses without altering the artist's original intention. But more than a technical project, it was a meditation. While her hands worked with tiny brushes and carefully dosed solvents, her mind processed the trauma of her situation. Each crack repaired in the canvas was a crack repaired in her own soul. Each recovered color was a fragment of hope rescued from oblivion. One night, 3 months after her wedding, Something changed. Grace was concentrated on a particularly delicate area near the portrait's left eye when she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Her heart froze. She had been so careful, so meticulous in hiding her nocturnal activities. Had someone followed her? Had Alexander installed security cameras without her knowing? The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Grace didn't turn around, paralyzed by the terror of being discovered. "So this is where you disappear every night." The voice wasn't Alexander's. It was feminine, with a marked Boston accent, and belonged to Lucy, the woman in charge of the building's cleaning. She was in her 50s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and small but shrewd eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Grace finally turned, the brush still in hand, not knowing what to say. Lucy approached slowly, examining the work with an expression Grace couldn't interpret. She spent long seconds in silence, studying the partially restored painting, before speaking again. "My grandfather was a restorer in Boston. He worked for the Museum of Fine Arts before the Depression." She paused. "I recognize good work when I see it." Grace exhaled a sigh she didn't know she'd been holding. "Please, don't tell Alexander anything. He doesn't know." "That his wife is an artist?" Lucy smiled for the first time since Grace had known her. "That man doesn't know many things, but I know how to keep secrets. I've worked in rich houses all my life. Secrets are the most valuable currency in these circles." She sat on an old trunk, crossing her arms over her apron stained with cleaning products. "Why do you hide it?" Grace lowered her gaze to her hands, to the pigment residue staining her cuticles in colors no manicure could disguise. "Because it's the only thing I have that's truly mine. Because if he knew, he'd find a way to use it, control it, turn it into something that no longer belonged to me." Lucy nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something she already suspected. "My grandmother also had to hide to survive. During the war years, she sewed flags inside the mattresses of the house where she served. No one ever knew, but she knew, and that was enough." That night marked the beginning of an unlikely alliance. Lucy became a silent accomplice, alerting Grace when Alexander returned earlier than expected, obtaining specialized materials Grace couldn't buy without raising suspicion, and offering silent company in those dark hours where loneliness threatened to drown her. But she also brought information Grace hadn't requested. "You should know," Lucy told her one night while Grace worked on a particularly damaged area of the canvas, "that he's not who he says he is." Grace looked up, the brush suspended in air. "What do you mean? I've cleaned his office for years. I've seen documents I probably should have ignored." Lucy lowered her voice, though they were alone. "The artwork he collects. Not all of it has legitimate provenance. There are transactions with false names, certificates of authenticity that seem too perfect, contacts in countries where laws are more flexible." Grace felt a chill run down her back. She knew Alexander was ruthless in business, but art trafficking, that would explain many things. His obsessive interest in collecting, frequent trips to destinations that seemed to lack commercial logic, phone calls he made in languages Grace didn't recognize. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Lucy shrugged with a simplicity that belied the gravity of her words. "Because I think someday you're going to need to know what kind of monster you've married. And because I like you, girl. You're different from the other wives I've seen pass through these houses. You have something in your eyes that suggests you won't stay forever." Grace returned her attention to the painting, but her mind was far away. "I won't stay forever," she thought. "But first I need to find a way to escape without destroying myself in the process." The winter arrived in New York with a coldness that seemed to reflect the state of the Sterling-Mitchell marriage. Grace had learned to read Alexander's moods, like a meteorologist reads weather patterns. She could predict storms in the tension of his jaw, anticipate deceptive calms in the softness of his voice. But lately something had changed in him. Business wasn't going well. That was evident. Phone calls had become more frequent and angrier. Dinners with investors, once celebrations of success, now had the tense tone of desperate negotiations. And Alexander, the man who always controlled every aspect of his environment, was beginning to show cracks in his perfect facade. One night Grace witnessed a conversation she shouldn't have heard. She was in the hallway, returning from her refuge in the basement, when Alexander's voice stopped her cold. "I don't care what it costs," he shouted into the phone, a level of loss of control he had never shown in her presence. "I need that authentication before Friday. Without it, everything falls apart." A pause. Then, with a more controlled but equally dangerous voice, "Listen to me carefully. I have an expert who can do the job. I just need time to convince her." Grace pressed against the wall, holding her breath. What expert was he talking about? And what job did he need that was so urgent it made him lose composure? The answer came 3 days later, in the most unexpected way. It was Sunday morning, one of the rare moments when Alexander seemed willing to play the role of attentive husband. He had insisted on breakfast together on the terrace overlooking Central Park, with freshly baked croissants and Colombian coffee he served himself. "Grace," he began, with a tone that tried to be casual, but which she immediately recognized as calculated, "have you ever been interested in art?" Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her neutral expression. "Art?" she repeated, buying time. "Of course, like any cultivated person. Why do you ask?" Alexander spread butter on his croissant with deliberate movements. "I've been thinking about expanding my collection. I have some pieces that could benefit from an expert eye, someone who could evaluate their authenticity, perhaps supervise some restoration." "That sounds fascinating," Grace responded, each word carefully measured. "I imagine there are professionals who do that." "There are." Alexander looked at her directly, and in his grey eyes, Grace saw something that looked dangerously like suspicion. "But professionals ask uncomfortable questions. They keep records. Sometimes it's preferable to keep things in the family." The silence that followed was thick as the hot chocolate cooling in the cups. Grace knew she was walking through a minefield, that any wrong word could detonate an explosion that would destroy the fragile balance she had built. "Unfortunately," she said finally, "my education in art was limited to school visits to the Met. I don't think I can be much help." Alexander studied her for long seconds, perhaps searching for some crack in her performance, but Grace had learned from the best. If he could fake love during an entire courtship, she could fake ignorance during a breakfast. "What a pity," he murmured, and something in his voice suggested the conversation hadn't ended, only been postponed. That night, Grace didn't go down to the basement. Instead, she stayed awake in the darkness of her room, thinking about the implications of that conversation. Alexander suspected something, or at least was looking for something, and if he discovered her hidden talent. The idea filled her with terror, but also with renewed determination. She needed a plan. She couldn't continue living in that cage, waiting for the moment when the jailer decided he no longer needed her. At dawn, while New York awakened with the noise of the first buses and the aroma of coffee from nearby shops, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She was going to escape. She didn't know how or when, but she was going to reclaim her freedom even if it meant losing everything else. The painting she had been restoring for months was almost finished. When she looked at it that morning, with the first rays of sun illuminating the recovered colors, it seemed to her that the woman in the portrait nodded slightly, approving her resolution. "Soon," she promised silently, "soon we'll both be free." Spring arrived in New York with the blooming of cherry blossoms in Central Park and warm air that promised renewal. For Grace, it also brought the opportunity she had been waiting for. Alexander announced a business trip to Shanghai that would keep him away for 2 weeks. It was the longest absence since their marriage, and Grace knew immediately it was her moment. The days before his departure were an exercise in extreme pretense. Grace was especially solicitous, even affectionate, personally preparing her husband's luggage and saying goodbye to him at the airport with a kiss on the cheek that he received with evident surprise. "Take good care of yourself," she told him, and for once the words contained genuine sincerity. She would take such good care that when he returned, she would no longer be there. The first hours alone in the penthouse were the most terrifying. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every noise suggested that perhaps Alexander had left someone watching her. But Grace forced herself to act with the same meticulousness she applied to her restorations. First, money. For months she had been saving small amounts in cash, coins from shopping, bills she found in forgotten pockets. It wasn't much, barely $4,000, but it would be enough to begin. Second, Documents, passport, birth certificate, college degrees. She stored everything in a small backpack that could go unnoticed. Third, and most important, the painting. She had debated with herself for weeks about what to do with it. It was too large to transport easily, and besides, it technically belonged to Alexander. But something in her rebelled at the idea of leaving it behind, abandoning it to the dust and oblivion from which she had rescued it. It was Lucy who found the solution. "I know someone in Boston," she told her the night before Alexander's departure. "A man who works at the Museum of Fine Arts. He was my grandfather's friend before the Depression. If you send him photographs of the work you've done, maybe he can help you." Grace followed her advice. She meticulously photographed every detail of the restoration, documenting the process from the initial state to the almost finished work. She sent the images by email, along with a technical analysis that demonstrated not only her skill, but also her deep knowledge of 18th century artistic techniques. The response came 2 days after Alexander's departure. "Dear Mrs. Sterling, the images you have shared are extraordinary. The restoration work you have done demonstrates exceptional talent and a profound understanding of art from that period. We would be very interested in meeting you personally. Would it be possible for you to travel to Boston to discuss a possible collaboration? Sincerely, Michael Patterson, curator of the Museum of Fine Arts." Grace read the message 3 times, unable to believe what she saw. She had not only found a way out, but possibly also a path toward the future she had always dreamed of. The decision was made. The day of her departure dawned cloudy, as if the sky wanted to cover her escape. Grace dressed in simple clothes, dark jeans, and a grey sweater that would have made her personal stylist pale. The backpack she carried contained only the essentials: clothes for a week, documents, money, and printed photographs of her restoration work. On the dining room table, she left a letter for Alexander, brief and direct. "I can't continue living a lie. Don't try to find me. There's nothing you can say or do that will make me return. Grace." She hesitated a moment before leaving, looking one last time at the penthouse that had been her prison for months. The silk walls, the antique furniture, the artworks she now knew were of dubious provenance. Nothing of that belonged to her, had never belonged to her. The only thing she took was what had always been hers: her dignity, her talent, and the determination to build a life worth living. Lucy was waiting for her at the entrance, with a paper bag containing sandwiches for the trip and a thermos of coffee. "Be careful, girl," she told her, hugging her with surprising strength for her age. "And when you get to where you're going, don't look back. Never look back." Grace nodded, unable to speak for the knot in her throat. Then, without more words, she walked toward Grand Central Station, where a train waited to take her toward her new life. Boston received her with fine rain and the smell of the sea. She got off the train at South Station, and for the first time in months breathed deeply without feeling the air was poisoned. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Michael Patterson would keep his promises, if she would find work, if she could survive without the financial cushion she had abandoned. But as she walked through the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, with the rain wetting her hair and the sound of seagulls mixing with conversations, she knew with absolute certainty she had made the right decision. She had escaped the cage. Now it was time to learn to fly. The Museum of Fine Arts occupied an impressive Beaux-Arts building, with columns that seemed to whisper stories of artists and patrons long forgotten. Grace arrived at her appointment with Michael Patterson soaked by the rain, nervous as she didn't remember being since her first day of college, and absolutely determined to prove her worth. Michael received her in his small second-floor office, a chaotic room full of books, catalogues, and pigment samples that accumulated on every available surface. He was a man of about 40, with disheveled brown hair, round-framed glasses, and hands covered with ink and paint stains. He didn't even seem to notice. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, but Grace interrupted him. "Mitchell. Grace Mitchell, please." Something in her tone must have revealed more than she intended, because Michael nodded understandingly, without asking more questions about the change of surname. "Miss Mitchell, then, the photographs you sent me are extraordinary. Let me be direct. I didn't expect to find work of this caliber outside the professional workshops of New York or Chicago. Grace felt the blush rise to her cheeks, but maintained her composure. I've studied on my own for years. Books, tutorials, experimentation. It's a passion I've had to keep secret for. Personal reasons. Michael took off his glasses and cleaned them absently with the edge of his shirt. I understand. We all have parts of ourselves we must protect from the world. He looked at her directly, and Grace saw in his eyes a genuine kindness that completely disarmed her. The question is, are you willing to stop hiding? The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours. Michael explained the museum's situation, a limited budget, a valuable but deteriorated collection, and a restoration team reduced to a single part-time specialist who had just retired. They desperately needed someone with talent and willingness to work in modest conditions. I can't offer you a salary comparable to what you're probably used to, Michael said, visibly uncomfortable. But I can offer you something that might be worth more. The opportunity to do work that matters, to be part of something bigger than yourself. Grace thought about the Manhattan penthouse, the unlimited credit cards, the designer dresses that filled entire closets, all that she had had, and none of which had been truly hers. I accept, she said, without hesitation. The first months in Boston were an exercise in total reinvention. She rented a small apartment in Beacon Hill, a 4th-floor walk-up with views of the rooftops and the distant harbor. The furniture was basic, the walls needed paint, and the hot water was temperamental. But it was hers, paid with her own work, and that made it a palace. Her routine established itself naturally. She woke early to walk along the Charles River before tourists invaded it, feeling the cold sand under her bare feet, and letting the sound of the water clean the residues of anxiety that still visited her in dreams. Then she walked to the museum, where she spent hours immersed in the work she loved. The first piece officially assigned to her was a Gothic panel from the 15th century, a Virgin and Child, whose darkened varnish hid colors no one had seen in generations. Grace approached it like one approaches a sick loved one, with reverence, patience, and the unwavering determination to restore what time had damaged. Michael watched her work with a mixture of professional fascination and something more that neither of them dared name yet. Their conversations, initially limited to technical aspects, began to expand toward more personal territories. He told her about his father, a craftsman from Vermont, who had dedicated his life to making handmade furniture, transmitting to him the love for work well done. She told him about her grandmother Hope, the only person who had known her secret talent, and who had died without ever seeing what her granddaughter could achieve. One autumn afternoon, when the leaves of the maples were dyeing the streets gold and the smell of roasted chestnuts filled the air, Michael asked the question Grace had feared and desired equally. "What really brought you here, Grace? And I don't mean the email with the photographs." They were alone in the restoration workshop. She concentrated on a delicate solvent cleaning, he pretending to review documents while watching her from the corner of his eye. The question floated in the air, like the dust motes dancing in the ray of sun entering through the window. Grace deposited the swab carefully and removed her nitrile gloves. She had learned that lies, however convenient, always ended up collecting their price. "I escaped from a marriage that should never have existed. My father sold me to a man who only saw me as a commercial asset. When I discovered the truth, I decided I preferred to start from scratch with dignity than to continue living in a golden cage without it." The silence that followed was different from other silences they had shared, denser, more significant. "Did he hurt you?" "Not physically." Grace sighed. "But there are ways to destroy a person without ever touching them. He knew them all." Michael nodded slowly, processing the information. Then, with a movement that seemed to have cost him considerable effort, he crossed the distance separating them and took her hands in his. "I want you to know something," he said, and his voice trembled slightly. "Whatever you've left behind here, you're safe, and if you ever need someone to defend you, to fight by your side, I'll be here." Grace felt tears accumulate in her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief, gratitude, something like the hope she had believed lost forever. "I don't need anyone to fight for me," she responded, "but perhaps I'd like to have someone to fight with me." Michael's smile was like the sunrise over Boston Harbor, slow, luminous, and full of promises. Winter arrived in New England with its characteristic fury, lashing the coast with 20-foot waves and winds that howled between the buildings of Beacon Hill. Grace had learned to love that climatic ferocity, so different from the mild winters of the South, feeling a secret affinity with the indomitable energy of the Atlantic. Her relationship with Michael had evolved organically, like a canvas that gradually reveals its true colors as darkened varnish is removed. There had been no dramatic declarations or grand gestures, only a gradual accumulation of shared moments, coffees at the cafe after work, walks through the public garden in the rain, improvised dinners at her small apartment where he cooked lobster rolls with the skill of a professional chef. "My father always said that a New Englander who can't cook is an incomplete New Englander," he joked while mixing the ingredients with precise movements that Grace found fascinating. Those nights, when the storm raged outside and they shared red wine and conversations that lasted until dawn, Grace felt she was finally living the life she had always deserved, a life built on solid foundations of mutual respect, shared passion, and radical honesty. But happiness, as she well knew, always has enemies. The first indication came in the form of an article in the New York Times magazine. The Museum of Fine Arts exhibition was attracting national attention, and a cultural journalist had traveled from New York to document what he called the miracle of Boston restoration. The article included photographs of Grace working and an interview where she spoke passionately about the importance of preserving artistic heritage. What she didn't know was that magazine would end up on the glass table of a penthouse in the Upper East Side, where a man with grey eyes like steel would study it with obsessive intensity. Alexander Sterling had returned from Shanghai to find the penthouse empty and Grace's letter waiting for him. His first reaction was fury. The burning rage of a man accustomed to controlling everything who discovered something had slipped through his fingers. He hired investigators, moved contacts, and for months searched for her with the determination of a hunter pursuing his prey. But Grace had been careful. She had changed bank accounts, communicated with her mother only through emails from internet cafes, and maintained a low profile that made her practically invisible to whoever searched for her. Until that article changed everything. The photograph showed her smiling, her hands stained with paint, holding a tiny brush while working on a medieval piece. Next to her, visible in the background, was Michael, looking at her with an expression anyone could recognize as pure infatuation. Alexander felt something he had never experienced before: jealousy. Not the loss of a property, which was how he had initially processed Grace's departure, but genuine jealousy of a man who possessed something he had never had. The love of a woman who shined, who bloomed, who became the best version of herself. Why with that nobody and not with him? What did that small-town museum curator have that he, with all his fortune and power, couldn't offer? The questions consumed him, but the answers he found only increased his obsession. He hired more investigators, this time specialized in personal profiles. He discovered Michael Patterson was the son of a craftsman who had worked briefly in his own mansion years ago, making custom furniture Alexander didn't even remember ordering. The irony was delicious and bitter at the same time. The son of his former employee had conquered the woman he had treated like a trophy. In early December, Alexander made a decision that would define the following months. He boarded his private jet bound for Boston, rented a car, and drove through torrential rain. He didn't know exactly what he would do when he found her, but he needed to see her, talk to her, understand what had gone so wrong. Or perhaps, in the deepest part of his twisted mind, he needed to get her back. He arrived at the Museum of Fine Arts just as it was closing, and saw her leave with Michael, both sharing an umbrella while laughing about something he couldn't hear. Alexander remained in the car, watching them walk toward Beacon Hill, their bodies naturally leaning toward each other, their hands intertwined with the familiarity of those who no longer need words to communicate. Something broke inside him. He didn't know if it was his pride, his ego, or perhaps some vestige of humanity he had kept buried under layers of ambition and manipulation. But in that moment, seeing Grace happier than he had ever seen her, Alexander Sterling knew he wouldn't rest until he destroyed what he had never been capable of building. If he couldn't have her love, he would make sure no one else had it either. The first encounter was at the opening of a temporary exhibition on American romantic painting. Grace had worked intensely for weeks preparing the pieces, and that night should have been a celebration of her effort. The museum was full of visitors, art critics and journalists, all admiring the restored works that gleamed under carefully designed lighting. Grace wore a simple black dress she had bought at a local shop, her only adornments a pair of silver earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She felt nervous but proud, surrounded by people who valued her work for what it was, not for who her husband was. Then she saw him. Alexander stood next to one of the gallery columns, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the museum's monthly budget. His presence was like an oil slick on crystal water, contaminating everything it touched with its mere existence. The terror Grace felt was visceral, primitive, a survival instinct that screamed danger with every cell in her body. But alongside terror arose something more. Rage. An incandescent fury at the audacity of that man to invade the space she had built with so much effort. Michael, perceiving her change in attitude, followed her gaze until he found the intruder. "Do you know him?" he asked in a low voice. "He's my husband." The words came out before Grace could stop them. "My ex-husband. We're in the process of divorce." Michael's expression hardened, but he maintained composure. He took Grace's hand firmly and guided her toward a group of guests, physically moving her away from Alexander while maintaining appearances. But Alexander hadn't traveled there to be ignored. He intercepted them by the drinks table, blocking their path with a smile that contained not a drop of genuine warmth. "Grace, what a surprise to find you here." His voice was soft as velvet but sharp as obsidian. "I've been so worried about you. You disappeared without a trace." "I left a letter clearly explaining my decision." Grace forced herself to remain calm. "There's nothing more to say." Alexander's eyes slid toward Michael, evaluating him with the contempt of someone examining an insect under a microscope. "And this is your new friend?" "Michael Patterson." The curator extended his hand with a dignity Alexander didn't expect. "Museum curator and Grace's colleague. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Sterling, Alexander Sterling." He didn't shake the offered hand. "Still Grace's husband, technically speaking." The tension was palpable, drawing curious looks from nearby guests. Grace felt the festive atmosphere transform into something threatening and knew she needed to act before the situation escalated. "Alexander, this isn't the time or place. If you have something to discuss, we can do it through our lawyers." "I just wanted to greet my wife. Is that a crime?" His tone was of wounded innocence, but his eyes told another story. "I came all the way from New York because I care about you. After all, you're still my responsibility." "I'm no one's responsibility but my own." Grace felt her voice gain strength. "And I'd appreciate it if you respected that." Alexander looked at her for long seconds, and in his expression Grace saw something that chilled her to the bone. He wasn't a defeated man who had come to negotiate. He was a predator who had found his prey and was enjoying the hunt. "Of course, dear, of course." He took a step back, hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Just remember, contracts have consequences. Your father knows that very well." With those words, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind an icy void Grace felt in the center of her chest. Michael took her outside the museum, to the cold air of the courtyard where the rain had stopped, leaving puddles that reflected the interior lights. He hugged her in silence, without demanding explanations, simply offering his presence as an anchor in the middle of the storm. "He can destroy my family," Grace whispered against his shoulder. "The contracts my father signed. If Alexander executes the terms, they'll lose everything. Then we'll find a way to protect them." Michael's voice was firm, without a trace of doubt. "Together, we'll find a way." Grace wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to believe there was a solution, a path that didn't involve sacrificing her freedom again. But she knew Alexander better than Michael could imagine, and knew that man wouldn't rest until he got what he wanted. The war had begun. The following weeks were an exercise in resistance. Alexander didn't disappear after the opening. Instead, he installed himself in Boston like an omnipresent shadow, appearing at cultural events. making public donations to the museum that couldn't be rejected without generating scandal, and weaving a network of influence that slowly tightened the noose around Grace. His tactics were subtle and devastating in equal parts. He sent exotic flower bouquets that arrived at the museum with cards that simply said, "Always yours." He reserved entire restaurants for dinners Grace never accepted, but which local newspapers reported as romantic gestures of a devoted husband. He hired photographers who followed her through the streets, capturing images that later appeared in society magazines, with headlines portraying her as a frivolous wife who had abandoned her millionaire husband. The Boston community watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. The fishermen at the harbor, who had come to know Grace during her morning walks, commented in whispers while repairing their nets. "That man from New York doesn't have good intentions," said Joe, an old sea dog who had seen wars and recessions pass. "Eyes don't lie. His are empty." The pressure also extended to the museum. Alexander publicly offered to buy the entire building during a charity dinner, promising to restore it with unlimited funds and turn it into a cultural beacon for New England. The proposal was obscenely generous, 3 times the market value, with the condition of being able to name the new direction. Michael rejected the offer with a dignity that even surprised Grace. "New England's cultural heritage isn't for sale," he declared before a room full of businessmen and politicians. "Not for 3 times its value, not for 30. There are things money can't buy, and integrity is one of them." The applause that followed was lukewarm, but the eyes that looked at Michael contained genuine respect. Alexander, on the other hand, watched him with an expression that promised retaliation. Nights became difficult for Grace. She slept little, haunted by nightmares where the walls of the Manhattan penthouse closed in on her, where Alexander's voice whispered threats she couldn't decipher, where her father's hands signed documents that condemned her again and again. Michael stayed by her side, offering comfort without demanding more than she could give. He prepared chamomile teas at 3 in the morning, accompanied her on silent walks along deserted beaches under moonlight, and listened patiently when she needed to talk about fears she had never confessed to anyone. "Sometimes I wonder if I've made a mistake," she admitted one night, sitting on the windowsill, while the lights of fishing boats dotted the dark harbor. "If my freedom is worth the suffering this is causing." Michael knelt in front of her, taking her hands with a tenderness that still surprised her. "Listen to me carefully, Grace. Your freedom is non-negotiable. It's not something you can hand over to buy peace, because that peace would be an illusion. What your father did was wrong, what Alexander is doing is wrong. And no amount of sacrifice on your part will change that. But my family, your family made decisions without consulting you. The consequences of those decisions are theirs, not yours." His eyes shone with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "You deserve to be happy, Grace. You deserve to build a life on your own terms, and if that means fighting the most powerful man in New York, so then that's exactly what we'll do." Grace wanted to believe him. With every fiber of her being, wanted to believe that love could triumph over power, that dignity could prevail over manipulation. But Alexander's shadow loomed over everything, darkening even the brightest moments. And then, just when it seemed the situation couldn't get worse, came the revelation that would change everything. It was Lucy who unearthed the secret. The woman who had been her accomplice in New York had maintained contact with Grace through sporadic emails, sent from public libraries to avoid any trace. Her messages were brief but valuable, fragments of information about Alexander's movements that allowed Grace to anticipate his tactics. But the message that arrived that February morning was different. "I've found something you need to see. I can't send it by email. I'll be in Boston this weekend. Meet me in Beacon Hill at the cafe where we used to have dinner after work, alone. It's important." Grace hesitated. The idea of meeting someone from her previous life awakened all her defensive instincts. But Lucy had risked much for her, and the urgency of the message suggested something more than a casual greeting. The meeting took place Saturday at noon, in a small cafe near the State House. Lucy looked older, more tired, but her eyes maintained the same shrewdness Grace remembered. "I don't have much time," she began, sliding a manila envelope under the table. "Alexander suspects me. He'll probably fire me soon. But before I leave, I needed you to have this." Grace opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photocopies of documents, private correspondence, and what appeared to be bank transaction statements. What is all this? Proof that your marriage was a trap from the beginning. Lucy lowered her voice. But not for the reasons you think. The documents told a story Grace would never have imagined. Alexander had been investigating her for years, long before their supposed chance meeting at that Charleston gala. He had hired detectives to study her life, her interests, her hidden talents. He had discovered her ability for art restoration through sources Grace couldn't even imagine. And he had planned their marriage with a very specific purpose, to use her skills to authenticate and restore artworks of dubious provenance that formed part of his private collection. Works that, according to the documents, had been acquired through illegal channels and needed a patina of legitimacy that only a competent restorer could provide. The humiliation on your wedding night, Lucy explained, was calculated. He needed to break you, make you submissive so he could control you when the time came to use you. The agreement with your father was real, yes, but it was secondary. What he really wanted was your talent. Grace felt the floor open beneath her feet. Everything she had believed she understood about her situation turned out to be merely the surface of a much deeper conspiracy. Why are you telling me this now? Because there's more. Lucy pointed to a specific document. Alexander is planning something big, a private auction in Geneva in 3 months, where he intends to sell several pieces that haven't been authenticated yet. Without you, those works have no value. That's why he's pressuring you, that's why he won't let you go. And if I report him, if I give these documents to the authorities? Lucy shook her head. He has lawyers who will make any accusation disappear. And you don't have concrete proof that the works are stolen, only suspicions. What you have here demonstrates intention, not crime. Grace looked at the documents scattered on the table, feeling a mixture of horror and liberation. Horror at the depth of the manipulation to which she had been subjected. Liberation because, for the first time, she completely understood the nature of her enemy. There's something else you should know, Lucy added. Michael Patterson, the curator you're with. What about him? His father, the craftsman from Vermont. He worked in Alexander's mansion 15 years ago. He made custom furniture, including some hidden compartments that Alexander later used to hide works. Lucy paused significantly. I don't know if Michael knows it, but there's a connection between them that goes beyond coincidence. Grace processed this information with difficulty. Could Michael be involved somehow? Had their meeting been as random as it seemed? Doubts began to germinate, poisoning the trust she had built during months. Don't rush, Lucy warned, reading her expression. The father died years ago. Michael probably knows nothing about this, but you had to know so you can decide with all the information. The meeting ended with a tight hug and the promise to stay in touch. Lucy returned to New York knowing she would probably lose her job, but satisfied she had fulfilled what she considered her moral duty. Grace walked for hours through Boston's streets, processing everything she had learned. The rain fell gently, mixing with the tears she couldn't contain. When she finally returned to her apartment, she found Michael waiting at the door with a worried expression. Where have you been? I've tried to call you all afternoon. Grace looked at him, searching his eyes for some indication of deception, some sign he could be involved in the web of lies that had trapped her. But she only found genuine concern, unconditional love, the same honesty that had attracted her from the beginning. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to listen until the end. That night, while the storm raged outside, Grace shared everything she had discovered. She spoke of the documents, of Alexander's intentions, of the connection with Michael's father, and he listened in silence, his face going through a spectrum of emotions ranging from surprise to indignation. When she finished, Michael remained quiet for long minutes. Then, with a voice trembling with contained emotion, he spoke. My father was an honest man. He worked with his hands, created beauty from wood, and died without a penny but with a clear conscience. If Alexander used his work to hide crimes, that doesn't stain my father's memory. The only thing it stains is Alexander. Aren't you angry with me for suspecting? Michael took her hands in his. You suspected because you've been betrayed so many times that distrust has become your armor. I understand, but I want you to know something. I'm not Alexander. I have no secrets, no hidden agendas. The only thing I have is love for you, and the determination to protect you from whoever tries to hurt you." Grace collapsed in his arms, sobbing with an intensity she hadn't allowed herself since that first night in New York. She cried for lost time, for destroyed illusions, for the father who had sold her and the husband who had treated her like merchandise. But she also cried with relief, because in the middle of all that darkness, she had found a light that didn't abandon her. When the tears finally ran out, a new feeling emerged in her chest. It wasn't fear, resignation, or even hope. It was something more powerful. It was determination. Alexander had wanted to use her as a tool. He had planned her life as if she were one more piece in his collection. But Grace was no longer the vulnerable woman who had fallen into his trap. She was an art restorer who knew how to reveal truth hidden under layers of lies. And it was time to apply that skill to her own life. The following months were a chessboard, where each move had consequences that extended in multiple directions. Grace, with Michael's help and a small group of unexpected allies, began to prepare her counter-offensive. The first step was to meticulously document everything related to Alexander's collection. Using the contacts she had developed in the art world during her year in Boston, Grace began investigating the provenance of the work she remembered seeing in the Manhattan mansion. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. At least a dozen pieces had dubious histories, with unexplained periods in their ownership records that coincided with documented thefts from smaller museums throughout Europe. It wasn't enough for a formal accusation, but it was a start. The second step was more personal, confronting her father. Richard Mitchell agreed to meet her at a cafe in Providence, neutral territory, where neither would have an advantage. It was the first time they had seen each other since her escape, and Grace barely recognized the man she had known all her life. He looked aged, diminished, with dark bags under his eyes and hands that trembled while holding his cup. "Daughter," he began, but Grace interrupted him. "No." Her voice was firm. "Don't start with empty apologies or convenient justifications. I want the truth, the whole truth." Richard lowered his gaze, and in that gesture, Grace saw something she had never expected: genuine shame. "I made an unforgivable mistake. I believed I was protecting the family, saving the business I had built for 30 years. Alexander convinced me the marriage would be beneficial for everyone, including you." "He convinced you?" Grace laughed bitterly. "He manipulated you, Dad, like he manipulated me. The difference is, you had a choice. I didn't." "I know." Richard finally raised his gaze, and Grace saw tears accumulating in his eyes. "And every day I wake up knowing I destroyed my daughter's trust for money. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know I'm sorry." Grace felt the temptation to scream at him, to discharge years of pain in words that would cut like knives. But she also remembered something her grandmother Hope had told her once. "Resentment is a poison you drink hoping the other person will die." "Forgiveness isn't something I can give you today," she responded finally. "Maybe I never can. But there's something you can do. Help me stop Alexander." The conversation that followed revealed information Grace didn't have. Richard, tormented by guilt, had kept copies of all documents related to his agreement with Alexander. He had also noticed irregularities in financial transactions, suggesting money laundering activities. And most importantly, he had a contact in the FBI who had been investigating the black market of American art for years. "Let me help you repair what I broke," Richard pleaded. "Don't ask me to stand aside while that man destroys the only good thing I've done in my life." Grace studied him for long seconds, searching for signs of deception, but she only found a man desperate to redeem himself, a father who had understood too late the price of his decisions. "All right," she said, "but this time we follow my rules." The unlikely alliance between Grace, Michael, Richard, and the FBI inspector began to bear fruit. They gathered evidence systematically, connecting dots that individually seemed insignificant, but together painted a devastating picture of Alexander's activities. Meanwhile, the Museum of Fine Arts International exhibition advanced toward its opening date. The centerpiece would be a 17th-century painting Grace had restored for months, a masterpiece attributed to a follower of John Singleton Copley that had remained hidden in the museum's storage for decades. The work was exceptional, and experts who had seen previews considered it one of the most significant restorations of recent years. The irony didn't escape Grace. She was preparing the professional triumph of her life, while simultaneously preparing the downfall of the man who had tried to use that same talent for criminal purposes. Alexander, for his part, intensified his tactics. He had dropped the facade of romantic husband and showed himself increasingly aggressive. He publicly threatened to cancel his donations to the museum, tried to bribe board members to fire Michael, and even hired journalists to write defamatory articles about the fugitive restorer who had abandoned her husband. But Boston proved to be hostile territory for his methods. The New England community, traditionally wary of outsiders, and especially of New York businessmen with airs of superiority, closed ranks around Grace and Michael. Harbor fishermen denied fish to restaurants he frequented. Hotel managers lost his reservations. Taxi drivers took him on long, expensive routes. It was a silent resistance, almost invisible but effective. "This city protects you," Michael observed one night while they dined in the small apartment they already considered their home. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're one of us." Grace smiled, and for the first time in a long while, the gesture reached her eyes. "You know what?" she said. "I think I finally understand what it means to belong to a place. It's not where you were born, or what surname you carry. It's where they accept you as you are, with all your scars and secrets." Michael kissed her softly, and in that moment, Grace knew all the pain, all the fear, all the humiliation had been worth it. It had taken her exactly where she needed to be. Now only the final act remained. The press conference prior to the opening was scheduled for a sunny Thursday in spring, when the magnolias bloomed in the public garden and warm air promised the approaching summer. Journalists from across the country and some international correspondents had gathered in the museum's main gallery to hear details of the exhibition that had generated so much expectation. Grace knew Alexander would be present. She had counted on it. What she didn't expect was the triumphant entrance he had prepared. He arrived accompanied by 3 assistants and a personal photographer, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the museum's annual restoration budget. His smile was radiant, that of a man who believed he had all the cards in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began from the podium, "it's an honor to present what we consider the jewel of our restored collection, a work from the 17th century that has remained hidden for generations and which today we can show thanks to the extraordinary work of our restoration director." Grace climbed the stage with firm steps, conscious of the cameras capturing every movement. She wore an ultramarine blue dress, the same color she had discovered under the varnish layers of the first painting she restored in that golden cage in New York. It was a silent reminder of how far she had come. "This work," she began, pointing to the painting revealed behind a velvet curtain, "represents not only a technical achievement, but also a symbol of what restoration can do. Reveal the truth that time and neglect have hidden." The journalists photographed frantically, impressed by the beauty of the restored painting, but Grace hadn't finished. "There's another truth I wish to share today. A personal truth I consider important for you to know." The murmur of expectation spread through the gallery. Alexander, seated in the front row, narrowed his eyes with suspicion. "A year and a half ago I escaped from a marriage that had been orchestrated without my consent. My husband, Mr. Alexander Sterling, treated me like property, an investment he had acquired to serve his own interests." The silence was absolute. The journalists, smelling blood, began typing furiously on their devices. "But that's not the most serious thing." Grace took out a folder from under the lectern. "The most serious thing is that Mr. Sterling had specific plans for my talent, plans that involved the authentication and restoration of artworks, whose provenance is, at best, dubious." Alexander stood up, his face transforming from surprise to fury. "This is slander. I demand this farce be stopped." "I have documents," Grace continued, unperturbed, "that demonstrate Mr. Sterling has been involved in the acquisition of artworks through channels that evade international legislation. Documents I've shared with the competent authorities." As if summoned, 2 FBI agents entered the gallery, followed by the inspector who had been coordinating the investigation. They headed directly toward Alexander. "Mr. Sterling," said the inspector, "please come with us. You have some questions to answer." The chaos that followed was memorable. Journalists shouting questions, flashes exploding, Alexander trying to maintain composure while being escorted out of the building. Grace remained at the podium, watching the man who had tried to control her life reduced to a common suspect. Michael came up beside her, discreetly taking her hand. "You did it," he whispered. "We did it," she corrected. None of this would have been possible alone. The investigation that followed exposed Alexander's activities to public scrutiny. Though legal processes would be long and complicated, the damage to his reputation was immediate and devastating. Investors withdrew their support. Business partners cancelled contracts, and the empire he had built began to wobble. Grace knew he would probably never go to prison. The rich rarely faced real consequences for their crimes, but she had achieved something perhaps more valuable. She had destroyed the carefully cultivated image that was the source of his power. Alexander Sterling would no longer be seen as a respectable collector, but as a questionable man whose motivations would always generate suspicion, and she, the woman who had escaped his control, was responsible. The exhibition opening was a triumph that exceeded all expectations. The restored painting gleamed under lighting specifically designed to highlight every nuance of color, every brushstroke recovered from oblivion. International critics described it as a revelation and the artistic rediscovery of the decade. Job offers arrived from prestigious museums in Europe and America, institutions competing for the talent of the restorer who had transformed a forgotten work into a star. But for Grace, the true triumph wasn't in the applause or laudatory articles. It was in the look she exchanged with Michael when the lights dimmed and the last guests left the museum. It was in the embrace they shared in the restoration workshop, surrounded by tools that had witnessed her transformation. It was in the certainty she had built a life based on her own terms with her own effort, depending on no one but herself. That night, they walked together along the Charles River, with the full moon painting a silver path over the calm waters. The sound of the waves was a constant lullaby, the same that had accompanied Grace during her first days in Boston, when she didn't know if she would manage to survive outside the cage she had abandoned. "You know what my grandmother once told me?" she asked, stopping to look at the horizon. "What did she tell you?" "That the women in our family were like old paintings, that life covered us with layers of dust and darkened varnish, but underneath were always the original colors waiting to be revealed." Michael surrounded her with his arms, protecting her from the cold wind blowing from the river. "And you revealed yourself," he said. "You removed all those false layers and showed the world who you really are." Grace nodded, feeling the truth of those words resonate in the deepest part of her being. "For a long time I believed I needed someone to save me. First it was my father, then it was Alexander. And when I escaped, part of me hoped you would be my next savior." She turned to look him in the eyes. "But now I understand that the only person who could save me was myself, and that doesn't diminish what we have. On the contrary, it makes it more real, more valuable." "Because you chose it freely," Michael completed. "Not out of necessity, not out of desperation, but because you wanted to." "Exactly," Grace smiled, and in that smile was a peace she had never before experienced. "I chose you. I choose this place, this work, this life. And for the first time, those choices are truly mine." They remained in silence for long minutes, contemplating the stars beginning to appear in the clear sky. The constellation of Orion shone over the harbor, the same Grace had observed from her window in Charleston when she was a child and dreamed of a future she then couldn't imagine. "What comes now?" Michael finally asked. Grace thought about the offers she had received, the possibilities opening before her like paths in an infinite forest. The Met had proposed she lead their restoration department. Galleries in London and Paris wanted to hire her as a consultant. There had even been an invitation from the Louvre to participate in a restoration project that would last several years. "Now comes what we decide together," she responded. "I don't know exactly where the road will take us, but I know I want to travel it with you." Michael kissed her, and in that kiss were wordless promises, commitments that needed no contracts or signatures. When they separated, both knew something had definitely changed, that the darkest chapter of Grace's life had finally closed. That night, as they walked back toward Beacon Hill with intertwined hands, Grace felt the weight she had carried for years had finally dissolved. Not because someone had removed it from her shoulders, but because she herself had found the strength to let it go. The past no longer defined her. The future was hers to build. The small studio near Boston Harbor smelled of linseed oil and freshly brewed coffee, a mixture Grace had come to associate with happiness in its purest form. The open windows let in the sea breeze and the distant sound of seagulls, while the golden light of sunset bathed the walls covered with works in different phases of restoration. She had rejected the Met's offer, also those from Paris and London. Instead, she had accepted a position as an independent consultant that allowed her to work from Boston, traveling occasionally when specific projects required it. It was a decision many didn't understand. Why reject the prestige of great institutions to stay at a modest New England museum? But Grace knew. Here she had found something no title could grant: belonging. Michael appeared in the doorway carrying 2 steaming mugs he deposited on the work table, with the care of someone who knows the importance of each object in that space. "You have a visitor," he announced. "Your mother is waiting at the museum." Eleanor Mitchell had traveled from Charleston for the ceremony to be held that afternoon. It wasn't a wedding. Grace had declared she would never formally marry again, and Michael respected that decision without question. But something that for both had more meaning: the inauguration of a restoration scholarship Grace had created in memory of her grandmother, Hope. The scholarship would allow young artists from humble families to study the ancestral techniques Grace had learned on her own, opening doors that would otherwise remain closed. It was her way of giving back what she had received, of transforming her pain into something that would benefit others. She went down to the museum accompanied by Michael, finding her mother in the gallery, contemplating the 17th century painting that had catapulted Grace's career to international levels. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, without taking her eyes off the work. "I always knew you had a special gift, daughter, though I never found the words to tell you." Grace hugged her mother, feeling the familiar scent of lavender that always transported her to her childhood. Things between them weren't perfect, perhaps they never would be completely, but they had begun to rebuild what secrets and lies had damaged. Richard hadn't come. Her father had accepted responsibility for his actions, fully cooperating with authorities in the investigation against Alexander. As a result, his own businesses had suffered, but he had started again with a small construction company that operated with transparency and honesty. Grace wasn't ready to forgive him completely, but they had established tentative communication, brief phone conversations, where he never asked for more than she was willing to give. The afternoon ceremony was intimate but significant. Harbor fishermen attended, along with Beacon Hill merchants, museum colleagues and friends Grace had made during her time in Boston. Lucy had traveled from New York, now working in a house where her employers treated her with respect. Even the FBI inspector made a brief appearance, quietly confirming that the case against Alexander was advancing favorably. When Grace approached the podium to give her speech, she looked at the sea of faces watching her with genuine affection. They were people who knew her not for who her husband had been or her family's money, but for the work she had done, the character she had demonstrated, the person she had become. "My grandmother Hope used to say that life is like an old painting," she began, her voice firm and clear. "Sometimes, layers of time and circumstance darken what we really are. Sometimes we believe the original colors have been lost forever, but beneath all that varnish, beneath all those wounds, the truth is still there, waiting to be revealed." She paused, finding Michael's eyes in the crowd. "This scholarship exists to remind us that we all have vibrant colors inside us, waiting for the opportunity to shine. It doesn't matter where we come from. It doesn't matter what obstacles we face. What matters is that we never stop searching for our truth, never stop fighting to be who we really are." The applause that followed was warm and sustained. When Grace came down from the podium, Michael was waiting with a smile that contained an entire future of possibilities. That night, while celebrating at a local restaurant with lobster rolls and craft beer, Grace looked around and felt a gratitude so deep it threatened to overflow. A year ago, she had been a broken woman, fleeing a golden prison toward an uncertain future. Now she was a respected professional, a beloved partner, a valued member of a community that had welcomed her as their own. Alexander Sterling continued facing the consequences of his actions. His reputation would never fully recover, and though he would probably avoid prison, his life would never be the same. Grace felt no satisfaction from his fall. Resentment required too much energy. She preferred to invest in more valuable things. But she didn't feel pity either. Each person was responsible for their own decisions, and he had made his. When the restaurant closed and the streets fell silent, Grace and Michael walked once more along the harbor, their steps leaving ephemeral footprints in the wet sand. The stars shone above their heads, the same ones that had illuminated that first night of freedom and all subsequent nights. "Are you happy?" Michael asked, a simple question that contained an entire universe of meaning. Grace considered the answer for several seconds, not because she had doubts, but because she wanted to find the exact words. "I'm more than happy," she finally responded. "I'm myself. For the first time in my life, I'm completely, absolutely, irrevocably myself." She stopped to look at the sea, whose dark waters reflected moonlight in silver waves that seemed to extend to infinity. She thought about the woman she had been, the obedient daughter, the humiliated wife, the prisoner of others' expectations. And she thought about the woman she was now, the recognized artist, the freely chosen partner, the creator of her own destiny. The journey hadn't been easy. The scars remained, reminders of battles she had fought with herself as much as against others. But each scar was also testimony of survival, proof of a strength she herself hadn't known she possessed. Michael surrounded her with his arms, and together they watched the dawn beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold. It was a new day, the first of countless days they would have ahead. "You know what's most beautiful about restoring a painting?" Grace murmured, resting her head against his chest. "What?" "That when you finish, the work isn't the same as it was originally. It's gone through centuries, suffered damage, been repaired. And yet somehow it's more valuable precisely because of everything it's survived, its history, its imperfections, its scars. All of that forms part of its beauty." Michael kissed her hair, perfectly understanding what she meant. "Like you." "Like all of us," Grace corrected, smiling. "Like all of us who've had the courage to remove the layers that hid us, to face the light even though it scared us, to choose to be who we really are even though the world expected something else." The sun finished rising, bathing Boston Harbor with a golden light that transformed the landscape into something close to sacred. Grace closed her eyes and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with salt air and tomorrow's promises. She had come to Boston seeking refuge. She had found a home. She had fled a golden cage. She had built her own wings. She had been stripped of her dignity. She had recovered her soul. And now, standing next to the man she had freely chosen to love, watching the sunrise paint the sky with the same colors she knew how to reveal in centuries-old canvases, Grace Mitchell knew with absolute certainty that the most important story wasn't that of her fall or her revenge. It was the story of her rebirth.